Jasmine Crockett was standing at the defense table, one hand lightly placed on a pile of folders, the other at her side, unruffled, crisp, not a wrinkle on her slacks, not a drop of sweat on her brow, her eyes never leaving Judge Randall Forrester's. The instant he raised his voice, the room braced. "Miss Crockett," he said, his voice strained, "this court does not tolerate political speeches masquerading as legal argument. You've had your warning once. If you persist, you persist." She didn't blink, Your Honor. "With all respect, do. This isn't politics, it's precedent, and I'm requesting this court to see the difference." Forrester sat back in his chair, lips clamped together. He was a man notorious for two things: his quick temper and his long memory. He stared at her like a person who'd just been informed their favorite rule was going to be bent. "You've been practicing long enough to do better," he said. $500 contempt of court. Contempt of court. Contempt of court. Contempt of court. Murmurs, but Jasmine didn't budge. The bailiff wrote on a notepad. The court clerk slowed, looked up. A kid, law student in the back, leaned over and whispered to his buddy, "Did she just get fined for using case law?" Jasmine cleared her throat smoothly. "Then I respectfully request the court's reasoning for the fine so it can be considered as part of the record on appeal." Forrester blinked. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned, least not in this way, from the benches over, from the bench away, from the benches this way, from the benches way, from the benches west and the benches. But Chief has questioned, and benches are and questioned, least not in this way from the benches as like, what? The list bitch question was not afraid, her tone deliberate, her eyes intent, her voice unshaken. "Excuse me," he said, more of a challenge than a question. "Do I find you in contempt?" She said, "I'm requesting the court's rationale so it can be recorded, should be reviewed if necessary." He adjusted in his seat. You could practically hear the tension buzz in the silence a few feet away from him. The prosecutor, Leland Briggs, a by-the-book sort of guy, waded through his own notes, with dramatic through his own notes, with dramatic through his own notes, with dramatic if considering, well imparted to a considerable for his children puts. This is the major strategic consultant, falls to out, well as Miss Child, not glance up. "You're teetering on being disrespectful," the judge cautioned, "and you're teetering on stifling a legitimate defense." Jasmine retorted, still even-tempered, still restrained, "I'm not yelling. I'm not giving speeches. I'm reciting federal case law and inviting the court to listen to the facts. If that constitutes contempt, then we've all lost something greater than $500. Someone took a deep breath in the gallery, a nervous chuckle, then silence once, Climpulus. One took a deep breath in the gallery, a nervous chuckle, then silence once. Felt like an eternity. His lips opened as if to speak, then closed. "Move on," he said at last, "before I make it 1,000. But that didn't arrest the change in the room, because something had occurred. She hadn't bellowed, she hadn't retreated, and somehow, without yelling, she'd gotten a lot of them. Sitting up, the judge scowled, annoyed, but also in a way uncertain, that fleeting moment when one in power experiences a crack beneath them and isn't quite certain whether it had quite certain whether it had mangums, whether it a sin. Just like when Parsons Creek, well, Nicholas and of niggas spoiler, there's only temperatives, whether it's the trains, isn't a sickly individual standing before them. But before he could get the room under control again, Jasmine turned the page, and what was to follow was going to shake more than just the silence of the courtroom. 2 days ago, Jasmine sat in a small corner office on the second floor of a downtown Dallas law firm, not one of those glassy skyscrapers with panoramic views and espresso stations, just a beige building with creaky floors and file cabinets that still had keys. She rolled pisses, little bundle stools. She pissed, eames of floors and file cabinets that still had keys. She pissed, and was hoses, Uncle So, had covered more courtroom floors than fashion show runways. Who's the arresting officer? She said, pen tapping on her notepad. Officer Trent Walsh appeared, the voice on the other line. Yanked. 6 protesters from a sedan outside the Northern Star Oil building charged them with unlawful assembly and trespassing. Were they violent? Nope. One of them was a teacher. The others were in their 20s. They were reading statements out loud, sitting on the steps. Jasmine ceased pacing, reading statements out loud, sitting on the steps. Jasmine ceased pacing, reading request, really lawful rules. Things on video. A dude live streamed it on FB. She stroked her hand down her face. She recognized this script. Corporate hires, private security, get spooked, calls the cops, charges, get tacked onto the books in order to frighten people into silence. But this one seemed tacky. I'll take it. She said, you sure nobody else handled it? They're calling it a waste of courtroom time. They've called me that before. By the end of that day, she had 6 case files laid out on her. By the end of that day, she had 6 case files laid out on her. She had 6 case files laid out on her. She had 6 case files laid out on her. Same manner, same arrest report, copy and paste with varying names. No statements from the actual building personnel, just a hasty affidavit and some grainy screenshots. But one thing jumped out. Officer Walsh testified he issued 3 loud verbal warnings prior to making arrests on the video, though he didn't even finish the first warning before pulling someone to their feet. That someone, Marissa Elkins' local art teacher, sported cat-eye glasses and kept a scat. Glasses and kept a scats. It's a scat. USA her sported cat-eye glasses and kept a scat. Vished a scat at the hüftvampany ogbany. The office on Sada so full days of swadam. Melosisha sported cat-eye. Even look up before. Unbummed slash upon beaven duty. Unbond better makes him haze. Berbriti setting on there's bowl. Bitzel fine betur to them cut some attend be subin. Surrey bissel wool foot word shall bomb in the look up. The form bissel of busy look in. It's the horse with to bore, star gristles. Walsh's hand closes on her wrist. Jasmine sat back in her chair. The tape froze on her monitor. She knew this case would not get headlines, but it mattered not only because people were arrested for sitting and talking, but because the system was banking on nobody noticing. That's why she didn't second guess stepping into the courtroom. This morning, she'd done her homework, pulled city codes, excavated 2 federal cases that fit the scenario almost to the letter B's. Regions that fit the scenario almost to the letter B. Almost it is that is destinies. Stefis to 12 the bada, B.U. If it's the felicities, swallow as this of letter bedibs. Will there be is this in those added dog work? Cold city codes, federal cases. That because Forrester, he wasn't stern so much as scornful. The type who found protests to be vociferous, rubbish, and thought civil rights arguments needed to be stuck in yellow textbooks, not live courtrooms before anything was underway. He scarcely glanced at her, scarcely greeted her clients. When she introduced herself, he grumbled, "We'll make this quick. Quick was code for quiet. Quick was code for don't make a scene." Jasmine never created scenes. She made argument, for crimes, argument, drama, and for argument, never created scenes. She made argument, usually. Clients sat next to her. Marissa, 2 college kids, a postal clerk, and a community gardener named Daryl, with a heart condition who had difficulty standing for long periods. Jasmine looked down the row. None of them seemed threatening. They seemed tired, nervous, like people who'd been told speaking up would cost them, and perhaps it might. But if she had any say in the matter, she breathed, "Stay quiet. I'll have my say." Marissa squeezed her hand beneath the table. "You always." Squeezed her hand beneath the table. "You always." Was not present to talk. She was present to break down each base accusation, and when she was through, even the judge would have to hear her out. By the time court reconvened, that afternoon the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just quieter. People leaned forward instead of back. They weren't there for fireworks. They were waiting to see what Jasmine would do next. Judge Forrester entered with the same stiff posture and pursed lips as always, but his eyes briefly but his eyes briefly, his eyes briefly, arseless, not quick. But there Jasmine stood before the bench, her notes in one hand, her other resting lightly on the table. Her voice didn't need volume, it had. "Wait, Your Honor," she began. "We're not here to argue property lines or property damage. My clients sat on concrete steps. They read statements. There was no violence, no damage. They didn't even obstruct entry to the building. They were arrested because someone didn't approve of what they had to say. Forrester cuts the Forrester cuts their cut, say Forrester cut clay. Forrester cut was the cut of Forrester Cutbrits. Retry the arresting officer's judgment. You are here to argue the merits of the motion to dismiss." "I am, Your Honor," she said, still composed, "and the strengths lie in the First Amendment supported by Martin v. City of Stroud, and most recently Holder v. Community Network." His eyes tightened. The last one, Holder, was esoteric, practically never cited. Most lawyers did not even mention it since it was from an appellate decision in Indiana. But Jasmine Jabus, discreet Jasmine Indiana. But Jasmine doesn't believe in Jasmine since rhetoric of the motion decision in Indiana. But Jasmine just was city was best working for station in Indiana. Voice low and Holder, the court decided that protesters detained outside an office building that is private could not be charged with trespass when the building functioned on publicly accessible property. Same configuration here. The front steps of Northern Star's headquarters are not gated. They're open to pedestrian traffic and business callers. The judge leaned back, folding his arms. So now we're referencing decisions out of Indiana. She nodded, not applying, drawing, and to take on a similar mode of how they deal with peaceful assembly. It becomes a pattern. Worth noting, the prosecutor Leland Briggs sighed loudly. "Your Honor, this is a stretch. These people violated the law, plain and simple." Jasmine turned to him. "Mr. Briggs, did you view the videotape of the arrests?" He shifted in position. The department released incident reports, so you didn't see the video. "That's not pertinent, respectfully." "It is because the repugnant, respectfully. It is because respectfully. It is because the relating what's to that's in the open and pertinent, respectfully. It is because the repall is remote respect and is refined and 3 warnings. The video indicates he gave him barely one before he seized Miss Elkins by the arm. No crowd order, no PA system, just his voice in a busy street. And even that he didn't wait to complete. Forrester flipped through the documents before him but paused. Halfway, his eyes rested on one paper longer than the rest. "Officer Walsh is not here for testimony today." He said. "No, sir," Jasmine replied. "The department stated he's on leave stress-related. He's on leave stress-related. How stress-related? He's on leave stress-related. He's on leave stress-related." "Mistake," Jasmine cut into her voice. "Still leaving. But this isn't a matter of blaming him. It's a matter of fixing the outcome of that mistake." For a fraction of a second, the room was silent. Once more, Forrester let out a slow exhale through his nose. His expression remained unmoving, but the hesitation spoke volumes more than his face ever could. He was computing it. He wasn't concurring, not yet, but he was hearing Briggs through one last jab she's making Briggs through one last jab she's making Briggs through one last jab she's making Briggs the waist and the twos. Glance at him. This isn't a heartless. Hard blocks that were lawns that this isn't dies. Grislaws Nickens at a verve. Lily glance at him. This isn't dines. Or glance at him. This isn't topums. Ways this and dal dev devicatal. Buddhas and tar with the lore of the citival. Whistle and thought excessive. Though the side one sadbus isn't dixit. television. This is my client's lives. They were threatened with criminal records over a silent protest on open stairs. If that's the system operating, then we have to wonder who it's operating for. The silence that ensued wasn't dramatic, it was awkward. Forrester looked back at the fine he'd handed out earlier that day. You could see he was starting to grasp. It wasn't just overly broad, it was reactive. But what he didn't yet realize was that Jasmine to the last page of her notes, her fingers just grazing the page, but her voice had all the weight it mustered. "There's another case I'd like to bring into the record," she said, glancing around the courtroom without raising her tone. "Donovan v. Metro, PD, 9th Circuit, 2016. Judge Forrester raised an eyebrow that was dismissed on procedural grounds. It was, Jasmine nodded, but the language which the appellate court used in their opinion created a court used in their opinion created a such as helpless lights with Tifford Court. Created a is a shift on letters. Quoting stains. There's a issue where she could attach this issue. Rick scoffed, now quoting case language from a case which didn't even go anywhere. "It's not the result I'm quoting," she said, turning to him calmly. "It's the court's definition of how officers deal with protests on publicly accessible private property. The court cautioned against vague directives and responsive policing, which, Your Honor, is precisely what Officer Walsh did." Forrester leaned forward, elbows on the bench, suddenly more attentive. "You're informing me You're informing me a sizeless was lusted. Vislafwanichibs, avoidly is informing me a sod, and was what working ought to supplant existing Texas law." "No," she said, "I'm informing you that the law isn't merely about punishment, it's about protection. And when we give weak cases a free pass by rubber stamping them, we legitimize sloppy arrests. Then all of a sudden, anyone standing on a sidewalk holding a sign is a criminal, even if they're reading from a notebook." Quietly on a public sidewalk, Briggs crossed his arms. He was losing the train of thought, and he knew it. But Desmond turned of this train of thought, and he knew it. But Jasmine visits Rachel's unbeliefs. It's even if it Jasmine is consequence. While Briggs crossed his arms, it was hot, calling and hated. Slowness to the front of the room, short of entering the jury box. "My client Darrell has heart issues. He sat down in protest because standing for too long could send him back to the ER. He said nothing, made no threats. The officer did not ask questions, only took hold of him. Same with Marissa, dragged up by her wrist like she was fighting. She wasn't. She was reading a quote from Dr. King. When he yanked her up, she stopped and glanced over at the judge. Your wrist. He stopped and glanced over at the judge. Your wrist is your mosaic, and bear it he ear it up. She stopped and glanced over at the judge. Your husband gets that for the wrist. Admitted in this courtroom. I know there are more significant cases, but if the justice system can't take these little moments where individuals are punished just for being seen, then what's the purpose of any of this? It was silent once more, but not stiff. More like everyone was readjusting. Judge Forrester gazed downward. He flipped through the arrest reports. Again, a line appeared between his eyebrows. His fingers paused at one name, Marissa Elkins. Miss Elk? Elkins, Miss Elk? Miss Elk? Marissa Elkins. Miss Elk? Voice tiny? Yes, sir. You're the one who was reading out of a book when you were arrested. Yes, sir. Out of a collection of speeches. I didn't move when he spoke because I didn't quite hear him. It was all so loud on the street. Forrester swiveled back to Jasmine. You claim this is all taped? Yes, sir. We have made a submission and time-stamped Officer Walsh's orders against the physical arrests. You'll notice he starts grabbing protesters 4 seconds after he gives his purpose seconds after he gives his what's these startling protesters over the block stores. Helpless all seconds after he gives his kidding. Yes, sir, which is it is all that is if physical arrests. You'll notice he starts warning. Forrester sat again with his jaw set. but his voice lower than last. "And you're seeking dismissal of all 6 charges. I am on grounds of illegal arrest, suppression of free speech, and police abuse of authority. My clients asserted a constitutional right in a public-facing environment and were punished because it made someone nervous." The judge didn't say anything. He glared at the folder on his desk, and for an instant Jasmine could see it. The flicker, an instant Jasmine could see it. The flicker, nens. Jasmine could see it. The flicker, nens, forthenningstimegelov. Resistance in a blush. The flicker, nensis liquors is just misletting. Resistance liquors. He just realized the ground he'd assumed was solid had a crack running straight through it. He reached for his gavel, but didn't strike. Instead, he stared straight at her. "I'll take the motion under advisement." She nodded once, respectfully. No smile, no sigh of relief, just stillness. Briggs didn't utter a word. Neither did the clerk, but the room was different now. Not just because of what had been said, but because no one was glancing at Jasmine like she was the pro. Like she was the pro. Like she was the pro. Seemed to settle. Judge Forrester opened the file one final time, and what he read afterward made all the difference. Judge Forrester turned the page with cold efficiency, page after page of arrest reports, statements by witnesses and detachments. Then suddenly he stopped. His brow creased. It was a minute detail, hidden in the back, an affidavit of a building security manager, Northern Star. Jasmine had already read twice. She knew the drill. This statement, Forrester said, she knew the drill, this statement, Forrester says. Fingers, this was from Belund Spice. The Mangers, this was from some from Offensic. Believe Zan, this was from the property manager. Yes, Your Honor, Jasmine responded. His name is Gerard Blanche. He signed the affidavit the day after the arrests. Did you present this? No, it was presented by the prosecution. Briggs blinked eye. Yes, it was included in the first packet from the department. Forrester began reading the report aloud during the time of the protest. The entrances to the building were not blocked and no physical harm was seen. Protesters sat on the fray. Protesters sat on the phrase. Protesters sat on the fray. Protesters sat on the phrase. Beneficus was the guard blocked. The procedure said of Slepeth. At our protesters, citizens apartment was seen. Protesters sat on the fraction, so deterred in the activity. Police were not called by property management, but showed up after a phone call from a private tenant on the 5th floor. He halted the courtroom, was still, then he read it again more slowly. Police were not called by property management. Briggs moved, Your Honor. That does not imply that the protest was legal. No, Forrester stated, his voice more pointed now, but it does imply the arresting officer didn't have guidance from the ownership of the building, from the ship of the building, of mound does imply the arresting officer didn't have guidance from the ownership of the building, or loveless, or lace bliss by the stilladian blizz malix cavities. Why did he blow up so fast? He glared at Jasmine, and for the first time since the trial started, his eyes didn't convey annoyance. They conveyed curiosity. She didn't follow up. She let the silence linger, then turned back to Briggs. Did you ask Officer Walsh about this? I know, sir. I based it on the arrest reports. Which is contradicting this statement. Briggs's mouth fell, then snapped shut again. Forrester turned to the bailiff. Pull up the video on the evidence. Mon will feel on the evidence. Mon for dollarbens. Mon wapden rubber. Mon was. The muster of the video on the evidence. Mon with it. Mon will the video on the evidence. Was shaky, but clear enough. The rumble of cars, driving by, a few voices in the background. Then Officer Walsh appears in frame, talking with what sounds like urgency, but without megaphone or microphone, barely audible. You could hear Marissa's voice as clear as day, and that's why the voices of the people must not be silenced. Then his hand closes in around her. Another protester stands in shock. He's pulled up next. No second warning. Forrester sat back again, face is us. A face fath them back again, face beside the article, video, and then he glanced at Jasmine. You wrote a memo on Holder V Community Network in law school. She blinked. How do you know that? He held up the same affidavit flipped to the back. Gerard Blanche said your name. He said you represented a tenant of his in a discrimination claim 7 years ago. Told you took apart their case in court, never raising your voice. The courtroom seemed to shrink. Suddenly didn't say that. He said, why, I didn't think it mattered. The video. Didn't me see that. He said, why, I didn't think it mattered. It didn't matter. Didn't really didn't do us. Just halving. Nothing better after the about it. It's also happening here. The medical say this to his festivals. You know the law, he said, and know how to apply it without drama. That doesn't happen. Then he turned to Briggs. I'm dismissing all 6 charges on grounds of lack of probable cause for arrest and failure to meet the burden of proof about unlawful assembly. Bang. The gavel struck the wood. Gasps. A few shocked glances. Darrell buried his face in his hands. Marissa emitted a soft laugh that devolved into a sob. Jasmine simply stood their eyes fixed on the bench, as if shays throat. As for the previous fine for contempt, you're removing it from the record silence. Once more, you've made your point, Miss Crockett. She met his eye. I wasn't attempting to. He nodded, barely, nearly like it pained. But before the courtroom cleared, one last discussion was in store outside of those double doors, and it wouldn't be from the judge. The wooden doors creaked open, and the courtroom cleared gradually, as if people weren't quite ready to leave the fake world, Jasmine, as if people weren't quite ready to leave the fake world, Jasmine. Jasmine just choose Endros. This people is of the Dajimus Judge, and the Ulfa Tutorst. They're from clear Jasmine drilled where they goers. Jasmine goes grease your city so. Clutched under one arm. She didn't talk. Not yet. Her clients flocked around her, quietly relieved, overwhelmed a bit taken aback. The corridor beyond was thin, the type of passageway where fluorescent lights hum weakly above, and each step rings too loudly. Darrell leaned against the wall, hand on chest, not of strain, just regaining breath. You saved us, he whispered. I actually thought I was going out of there with a conviction for sitting down. You didn't violate the law, Jasmine. There's a difference. Marissa moved forward, her voice still catching. Can I ask you something? Of course. How did you remain so calm in there when he fined you, when he cut you off? I would have lost it. Jasmine smiled a little. You can't fight fire with noise. Judges don't hear anger. They hear structure. They hear certainty. I knew what I had, and I trusted it. But he was prepared to send you away. Marissa said he spoke to you, as if you were wasting his time. Jasmine glared over he. He is over here. He's been glared over he. He has been glared over here. Courtroom. He didn't view me as a lawyer, not at first, just another voice in the crowd who spoke too much. So I gave him something. He couldn't debate the law, no attitude, no show, just facts arrayed like dominoes. The young law student who'd been in the back before came up nervous. Excuse me, Miss Crockett. Yes, he looked nearly embarrassed. I've heard your name before in a filing you made 2 years ago on that housing case. I encountered UNT Law. I just thank you. That was a Mama, also love to make all law. I just thank you. That was a mama. That was a my before law. I was a my law. I was a my voice to this law. Work you in a show the law, and then it was a my law. I just thank you. That was a mental side. Was just a surgery. Not about being amazing. Men barstool, bike meal, hot milf beings, and that point say reprise and mains. Not about being amazing. Jewish super to P fields in milder pinks into his corner of work loft up being amazing. And they'll them biz. Rubies. Bull will forward bald helpful soon the end and thing so far to not about being amazing. It's about being consistent. You arrive prepared, even when nobody believes you should, especially then behind her footsteps came deliberate slow Jasmine turned, and there stood Judge Forrester, no robe, now just shirt and tie jacket draped over one arm. He stared at her with something approaching humility. Judge Forrester remained there, silent but still in control. He was still a man who enjoyed control. That hadn't changed. I forgot about that housing case. he said, "until I saw your name again." Jasmine didn't say anything. "You presented a rent control loophole before Judge Lassiter, isn't that correct?" "I did," she said. "You won." She nodded, almost imperceptibly. He breathed slowly. "Your style isn't boisterous, but it stays with you. I recall now." Jasmine did not smile. This was not about acknowledgement. It was about justice. The aim, she said gently, was never to be noisy. It was to make it just. Forrester eyed her judiciously. "You see, years later I taught procedure law. I instructed my students not to become artistic with civil rights cases. Told them the court doesn't appreciate poetry." She arched an eyebrow. "Do you still think that?" A silence as long as a lake. "I'm beginning to think," he said, "it makes a difference who's saying it." That hung there for an instant. Not quite a compliment, but something more profound, a turning. And then he did something surprising. "If you ever think about taking the bench, you'd be good at it." Jasmine's eyes didn't blink. "I'm not finished with this section yet." He nodded. "Fair enough." And with that, he spun on his heel and left. Darrell glanced over. "You gonna take that as a win?" Jasmine breathed slowly. "No," she replied, "just a start." But there was more to the story. Not until someone younger, observing from the sidelines, caught up with what they had just seen. That night, Jasmine sat outside a small cafe in Dallas. The sun was going down. Long shadows crept across the pavement. Her blazer was folded on the ground beside her. A glass of iced tea remained untouched. Across from her was Nico, a first-year intern, only 2 months into law. Notebook open, pen still, full of questions. "I don't get it," he finally said. "You could have snapped back when the judge fined you, dismissed you. Why didn't you?" She stirred her drink softly. "Because the moment I make it personal, I lose control of the conversation." "But it was personal," Nico said. "He disrespected you." "Yeah," she said, "it was. But justice doesn't concern itself with how you feel. It only hears when you talk its language." "He attempted to discredit you," Nico put in. "I see it all the time," she said. She leaned in slightly. "You ever see someone attempt to lift a weight they aren't trained in? They're straining. They panicking. They dropping it. That's what injustice feels like when you don't have the proper tools." Wasn't about bragging. It was about bending the law in the right direction. "That judge believed he had a hammer, and he believed I was just another nail. But the thing is, hammers don't work on steel." Nico's eyes went wide. "So you walked in ready," he said. "I walked in solid," she said. "Because there are times you don't get second chances. You get one shot to make people believe the truth. And if you blow it screaming, they'll only recall the din." He sat down, staring at his notebook. "I want to be that good someday." "You will," she said, "but not by attempting to be me. Be better. Master the law like a foreign language. Know every corner of it. And one day, when someone tells you you're out of line, you won't shout. You'll simply raise your evidence." They sat there quietly for a moment. Then Nico asked one final question. "Do you ever tire of it?" She finally sipped her tea. "All the time," she replied, "but I tire more of watching people lose because no one came." Down the street, 2 teenage girls walked past, still carrying protest signs. One, "We have the right to speak." The other, "We're not going away." Nico saw them as well. "They don't even know what you just did for them," he told her. "They don't need to," Jasmine responded. "They just need to know that someone fought for the rules to keep them safe. That's enough." She put her belongings away, standing up. "One day," she said, "someone will think of you the way you thought of me today, and they'll recall what fairness sounds like. Don't take that lightly." He nodded, quiet again. But something had shifted in his eyes. As Jasmine turned and walked away, the sun set behind the buildings. Her shadow trailed behind her, quiet, steady, unwavering. Because sometimes the loudest voices don't ring out. They just endure. If you believe in justice, the kind that doesn't scream but perseveres, if you believe in showing up even when nobody thinks you will, then share this story. Subscribe to more real moments that matter. Leave a comment below with what you would have done in Jasmine's place. And never forget, justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to move.